What does this look like to you? I'll give you a moment. That image has no alterations, no filters, and no humans. The three people who seemed to occupy this image appeared when Stella Lansing was filming an empty road. This is one of the most convincing cases with picture proof that we are not alone. Lansing wasn't making up a story to get famous on social media because at her time, there was no social media. She was a housewife in the 1960s when it was impossible to take the kind of pictures and footage she captured. Experts are still unable to explain much of it, so it's not surprising that poor Stella was terrified of what she saw on a fateful night in 1961. Stella was in her home in Northampton when she noticed something outside, a bright orb hovering mid-air roughly half a mile away from her. She realized that what she was seeing was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Suddenly, the orb was just a few feet away from her before she could even blink. It wasn't a vehicle or lamp. It was barely solid, but it was definitely something. The strange orb continued to hover between Stella's house and her neighbor's garage. She kept hoping that someone else would see the light, but was too scared and confused to call anyone. After a few minutes of hovering, the orb just zoomed away and vanished. Stella's encounter with the orb was the strangest experience she had had up to that point, but it would become the least weird incident she would report, because after that incident, things kept getting weirder. On November 9, 1965, 30 million Americans lost access to electricity during the largest power outage in North American history. Massachusetts, the state where Stella lived, was among those affected. And in the pitch-black darkness, Stella's visitors returned. Lansing decided to visit her friend to check up on her. She took spare candles with her in case her friend didn't have any on the blackest night in American history. But then, she noticed the last thing anyone would expect that evening. Stella noticed a bright light above her. When she focused on it, she noticed that it was the same orb she had seen back in 1961. She had so many questions in her head. What was it? Was it causing the outage? Why was she always the one to see it? And that's when she noticed that she wasn't the only one around. In fact, there was a strange dark car that came out of nowhere and overtook Stella. The car had its lights killed, which was pretty strange for that night. The orb seemed to be pulling the vehicle, which rolled off the highway and went down a hill. As the black car stopped, the orb went down before shooting up into the sky and vanishing completely. Stella felt like she was being watched, so she stepped on the gas and didn't look back until she was at her friend's house. For the next 2 years, Stella kept trying to reinterpret what had happened. Perhaps the orb was just the light from the black car. Maybe it was a reflection of her own headlights. But every time Lansing convinced herself that what she saw was anything other than a floating orb of light, she would be visited with another floating light. On a few occasions, the lights started following her until she reached another person. That's when they would vanish. If only she had a smartphone to capture what was happening. But alas, this was the 1960s, and Stella didn't even have the old-school cameras that were available back then. But then, everything changed when one of Lansing's kids pointed at the sky, and when Stella looked up, there it was, the light. Lansing's fear that she was going insane was replaced by an even greater fear. Something was following her. But little did she know that her scariest experience was yet to come. In 1966, on Halloween night of all nights, Stella had her biggest scare. At around 7:20 p.m., she parked her car facing a nearby lake. She was about to cut the lights and exit the car when she paused for a second. This pause might have saved her life, because when the lights were still on, she noticed a head emerging from the lake. It was coming up too slowly for a human. It didn't take long for Stella to realize that the figure emerging from the lake was a threat. She immediately reversed her car just in time as the creature turned its head and noticed the vehicle. Within seconds, the creature had crawled onto the shore, but Stella got a clear look. She saw a humanoid creature who seemed to be wearing a black skull cap, and it had some sort of strange limbs that allowed it to move very quickly. The creature could have easily caught up with Stella's car, but as it began to run, Lansing noticed that it was growing smaller. To her relief, she realized that the creature was going in a different direction. Lansing turned her car to keep the headlights on the creature, but the thing had vanished. Instead, what Stella saw in its place was an orange orb of light, roughly the size of a basketball. It was surrounded by a fuzzy mist. Just looking at it gave Stella goosebumps. She was too scared to move or call for anyone. While she was fixated on the orange orb, a bigger, brighter orb, nearly red in color, swooped down from the sky and zipped behind her house before flying across the water. The red orb was witnessed by her 2 teenage neighbors as well. And though this was the first time anyone other than Stella and her kids saw the flying object, the creature Stella saw would remain the highlight of that night. Because before that, whatever Stella would see could be described as a phenomenon as something. But this was a creature, which meant it was a someone. After 6 years of being haunted by strange floating lights, Stella got an 8mm film camera, hoping to capture some proof. The year was 1967, so what she had wasn't a DSLR with instant playback. The camera couldn't even capture sound. And whatever video she got, she could not play back without a projector. That's 1967 technology for you. Even though Lansing couldn't play back the visuals she was recording, she didn't stop recording. On February 18, 1967, Stella was on Route 32, near the intersection of Warren Road and Flint Street, when she saw strange lights. Lansing got out for a better look and noticed another driver who had also stopped for the same reason. She asked him if he could see the lights as well. He said yes. Lansing remembered that she had a camera, but it was back at her place, so she jumped in her car and started driving. She was afraid the light would vanish by the time she got her camera. But to her surprise, when she came back, there were 2 lights. And moments later, there were 4 as 2 bigger ones emerged and joined the scene. One of the lights, a bright red one, stopped and bounced like a rubber ball. Lansing tried her best to follow it with her 8mm film camera.
Suddenly, this burst of light came off of the knoll where I was just facing there and shot up. It seemed like in that direction, toward the moon, in the direction of the moon, south, southwest. And as it did, all these multicolored lights were flashing. And that's when I got this object that looks like arms sticking out.
She didn't want to leave anything to chance, so she pointed her camera at every orb, carefully observing and filming the lights. At this point, Stella didn't even know if the camera film would be able to capture the lights, because she couldn't play the recording without a projector. But she was now sure that other people could see the orbs. One of her friends who was driving home from a late shift also stopped by and marveled at the floating lights. Shortly after, the lights disappeared, leaving the 2 women in complete darkness. Seconds later, a bluish light appeared a short distance away from where their cars were parked. It began to float towards them, ever so slowly. In her excitement, Lansing had forgotten that the lights, no matter how marvelous, were coming from an unknown source. She remembered the creepy creature that crawled out of the lake near her house. What if something like that was coming towards her? She braced herself as the blue light got closer and closer and closer. Then, when it was 150 feet away, it paused and flew in a different direction. Lansing and her friend both kept their eyes on it, but were almost blinded by a sudden burst of white light that came from yet another object, which zipped across the sky. As Stella snapped out of her state of surprise and awe, she realized that her camera was rolling the whole time. Now, Lansing was excited to play back what she had filmed for the first time. She went to a laboratory in Springfield to get her film developed. That's when she learned that half of the film she had loaded onto the camera was spliced incorrectly and didn't contain anything from that night. But, fortunately, the first half of the film had captured the events of that night. And when Stella got her own Bell & Howell projector in April of 1968, she could finally slow down the footage she had captured at 2 frames per second. And even she was surprised at the results. A few frames from that night seemed to have captured an alternate dimension, because instead of a dark road, what Stella saw was an interior with 4 strangers seemingly engaged in a discussion. Lansing labeled it The Occupants and showed the film to her friends. They all agreed that what Lansing's camera had captured was a space occupied by 4 strangers. Was this the close-up of what was happening inside the lights? Were the lights some sort of portals to a different time and place? Stella did not have an answer to any of this, but she had learned something far more important. Previously, she was unsure whether or not her camera would capture the lights that her eyes could see. But after slowing down the film, she realized that the camera could see a lot more than the naked eye. So Lansing started filming random places at random times. And each time, when she slowed down what she had captured, she saw strange and mysterious objects. Like the clock series, where a bunch of saucer-shaped objects seemed to appear in random frames. The saucers themselves would be different across photographs, but their clock marker arrangement would not change. This is very easy to do on Canva today, but in the 1970s, it was impossible to fake this without the help of an entire studio. It's worth noting that Lansing was literally a housewife who had not held a camera for the majority of her life. Lansing also never tried to get national media attention with what she had captured. Whenever she contacted anyone, it was out of sheer curiosity, because she wanted to understand why she could capture the strange phenomenon that no one else could capture with her camera, or why she could capture it on any camera she used. And one of the people she got in touch with was Dr. Berthold Erich Schwarz, a psychiatrist with a keen interest in the paranormal. Stella had gone to a UFO conference hoping to find answers, but most speakers were self-reporting abductees who described experiences she could not relate to or even believe. It was ironic that Lansing had more evidence of the paranormal than most speakers present, who simply had descriptions of events that could be made up. But when it was Dr. Schwartz's turn to speak, he didn't describe little green men. He didn't talk about getting probed by weird beings. Instead, he talked about the psychological impact and the non-physical dimension of UFOs. This resonated with Lansing, who had experienced serious stress and emotional difficulties because of being followed by strange lights. Schwartz's position that UFOs might exist in another dimension that only some can glimpse was the closest thing to an explanation that Lansing could accept. So when Schwartz finished his lecture and everyone started to leave, Lansing hung around. Eventually, a friend introduced Dr. Schwarz to Stella, who immediately jumped into her story. Initially, Schwartz wasn't sure if he was talking to someone haunted by strange phenomenon or a mentally unwell individual suffering from hallucinations. She told him about seeing little footprints, voices coming out of nowhere, getting zapped when trying to photograph a shimmering figure, and the creature from the lake. With each new account, the doctor's disbelief kept growing. But then, Lansing reached the part of her story where she managed to capture evidence on 8mm film. This got Schwartz's attention. Aside from the film, Stella had thousands of pages of notes that she had taken well before she ever got a camera. So Schwartz knew that this wasn't someone who had accidentally discovered a camera trick and decided to make up a story for fame. Lansing had been describing what she captured on film in notes she had taken half a decade before she got a camera. So he knew that at a minimum, Lansing really believed what she was saying. And just to make sure it wasn't in her head, Dr. Schwarz performed a series of tests, including a physical exam, a neurological one, and an EEG. It seemed like there was nothing wrong with Stella. But then, Stella dropped a bombshell on the doctor. In one of her psychiatric sessions, Lansing told Dr. Schwarz that in 1967 she had checked herself into a state hospital because being followed by strange lights had taken a toll on her. There she had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and her paranormal accounts had been chalked up to hallucinations. So it makes sense that Lansing got a camera that year. She genuinely wanted to know if she was going crazy. And fortunately for her, Dr. Schwarz was more open-minded than whoever diagnosed her in 1967. He didn't dismiss her even when she told him that she was getting telepathic messages from Beelzebub, the literal devil. Dr. Schwarz concluded that Lansing wasn't seeing things because of mental problems, but that she had mental problems because she was seeing things. He also noted that the temporary psychosis that Lansing suffered in 1967 no longer affected her perception or judgment. Then he started examining Stella's films, which featured strange blurry flashes of light zipping across the sky. There were also images of strange structures and weird figures that seemed to inhabit a different dimension. In some of Lansing's photos, disembodied arms appeared completely out of place. Only a fraction of these films and images have been made public. One of them features Lansing herself, perfectly fine in one frame, but in the very next frame, a weird lesion appears on her cheek. Again, this would be difficult to fake without a film studio. It wasn't like Stella could pause filming to apply makeup and return in the same pose before resuming. And even if she did anything to the film itself, experts would be able to detect it. But when experts got involved, almost every explanation they had fell short. At one point, Dr. Schwarz got tired of looking at images and film and decided to check out the phenomenon himself. Since Stella said she seemed to have eyes for where the orbs would appear, he asked her if she knew where they would show up next. She told him they could catch a glimpse of the floating lights in a specific spot on the coming Thursday. So on April 15th, 1971, Dr. Schwarz went along with Lansing and one of her friends to the place where she said the lights would appear. They turned off the headlights and killed the engine, letting the darkness envelop the car. Then they stepped out. All they saw was complete darkness for about 2 minutes before two floating discs of light appeared, just like Lansing had predicted.
In 1971, Dr. Schwarz himself filmed this breakthrough field study. He and Stella journeyed from Springfield, Massachusetts to Munson Hill, to the power lines where Stella first photographed the occupants.
Stella's saying, so they're going to come, they always do. And by golly, we see these two orange or reddish-orange globes. First there's one, then there's two, they're blinking, they seem to hop around. Aim my camera at it, I hope I'm capturing this, I don't know. What does this mean?
The orbs bumped and gelled into each other before splitting up. They kept gliding and merging in front of the three spectators, who were too stunned to notice that they had company. Just behind them was a black car. Its headlights were off. The car kept closing in on them, yet none of them noticed until it was about 100 feet away from them. Then, the black car turned on its headlight, taking them by surprise. Dr. Schwarz wrote about the experience, explaining how Lansing's friends screamed for them to get back in the vehicle. That was what it took for Schwarz to become a Lansing believer. He wrote a paper on Stella Lansing's film collection and its implications, which was the extent of the coverage she got. Almost 20 years passed before Lansing's story got media attention. In 1991, Sightings, a paranormal TV show, did a segment on Lansing. Had she employed any camera trickery, 20 years of technological advancement would surely expose it. The Sightings crew exported Stella's silent 8mm film of the occupants onto VHS, and that's where they stumbled upon the greatest mystery of this entire story.
Replayed here at a slower speed.
They played the tape over and over, often switching places to listen carefully. There was no mistaking it. They were hearing what sounded like human whispers. Stella could have faked everything, but how did she capture audio with a camera that could not record sound? Those old cameras just took a lot of pictures on a long strip of film, and when the frames were played at speed, the pictures would appear to be moving. There was no mechanism to capture audio, but not only did Stella grab images of men who were not visible to the naked eye, but she also grabbed audio that her device could not capture. The crew also gave her different cameras, and every time, regardless of what kind of device she was using, she would capture strange lights and weird structures. In contrast, when anyone else used Lansing's old camera, they would get normal pictures. It was clear that what Lansing had been experiencing was not ordinary, but as for what it was, Stella would never know. She kept taking notes with dates and specifics every time she had a strange experience. Never trying to sell the story, Lansing kept journaling and recording privately until she passed away in 2012. So, what was going on? One simple explanation, of course, is that it was aliens. They might have technology to hide themselves from us, but when they noticed that Lansing appeared to be able to see them, they started getting closer to study her. That would explain why, on some occasions, her children, teenage neighbors, and finally adult friends could see the lights. The closer the aliens got, the more evident they became to regular humans, but at a distance, only Stella could pick them up. And if that theory is accurate, then the black car following Stella could be good old Uncle Sam. The government would definitely want to keep an eye on an individual who could interact with aliens. And speaking of the government, there is another explanation. This was the 1960s, when the technological arms race between the US and the Soviet Union was at its peak. A lot has been declassified since then, including Operation MK-Ultra, in which the government studied telepathy and mind control using LSD, among other things. So maybe what Lansing was seeing was some sort of advanced government technology, or it could be something the government itself was studying. Project Blue Book was an Air Force program that investigated UFO sightings from 1952 to 1969. And while most people chalk up verbal accounts from then to made-up stories, the government continues to take unidentified flying objects seriously. A year after the launch of YouTube, the Pentagon started running the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which researched and analyzed UFO encounters. They also replaced the term with UAP, Unexplained Aerial Phenomena, to include hovering lights and other strange phenomena. The latest intelligence report reveals that studying 144 UAP incidents, government experts have been unable to explain most of them. So what shot did poor Stella Lansing have of explaining any of it, especially if what she was experiencing was spiritual? The final theory is that Lansing was able to peek into the spiritual world, that she could open portals into a spiritual dimension and capture impressions from it. It would certainly explain why she captured human-looking occupants, but it would also imply that the lake creature she encountered is something that awaits us on the other side. That is terrifying. But not to critics who explain Lansing's work as a combination of hallucinations and camera glitches.
Sighting.
There is usually a rational and mechanical explanation for what produced a given image on the film, as opposed to a supernatural answer.
The idea that Stella was experiencing more than just mechanical failure first occurred to her while shooting these high-tension wires near her home in Massachusetts.
Suddenly, this burst of light came off of the knoll where I was just facing there and shot up. It seemed like in that direction, toward the moon, in the direction of the moon, south, southwest. And as it did, all these multicolored lights were flashing. And that's when I got this object that looks like arms sticking out.
A frame-by-frame analysis of Stella's Super 8 film reveals these astonishing images. A group of 4 men, which photo experts have named the occupants. In the 20 years since this Super 8 image was captured, photo analysts have debated its authenticity. I took the footage of the occupants to the Brooks Institute, the prestigious photography study center in Santa Barbara, California.
What could affect a photographic negative like that?
A straight light entering from a small hole near the camera lens, possibly some kind of after effect when the film was taken out of the camera, some kind of a very fine, hard, and short light strike that produced those patterns.
For starters, what Lansing described wasn't always what she photographed. She did not experience flying arms or see strange men in random rooms. but that's what she seemed to capture on camera. The only creatures she saw, the creepy crawler and the shimmering figure, she never got to film, so what she was seeing on the camera wasn't connected to what she was presumably hallucinating. When you combine this with a psychological phenomenon called pareidolia, a normal explanation begins to emerge. Pareidolia is our tendency to see faces where there are none. The human mind is very imaginative, and for someone who is already hallucinating, seeing faces and objects in grainy photographs isn't that hard, and when she pointed them out, others could begin to see them as well. Maybe what Lansing saw was special, but her ability wasn't that she could see aliens. Maybe she could just turn anything she saw into aliens.
Patterns on Stella's photographs. What do you make of them?
I can find some rationale in calling them a mechanical problem in the camera. Some of the consistencies from frame to frame indicate that the exposure was produced not in the camera, but somewhere as a light leak entering the camera, or some other pattern. The pattern appears to be very similar, but not always the same.
The only thing wrong with this seemingly perfect explanation is that Lansing's friend and Dr. Schwarz also saw the lights. They could not have collectively hallucinated that, because they even filmed the lights floating in the night sky. Then there's that weird audio that her silent film somehow captured. Again, if you really want a normal explanation, you can chalk it up to lies and deceit. Dr. Schwarz had a large following of UFO enthusiasts, so who's to say that he didn't lie and even help set up the floating lights hoax for the camera? After all, he did replace Lansing's earlier diagnosis of schizophrenia and hallucinations with that of temporary psychosis.
We're more curious because here is a human being that gets these things, the kind of things you read about in the paper, but they're seldom documented as one would prefer. Questions and questions and questions, but then it becomes fascinating, a real mystery of the first order. In some way by this housewife.
Ran the clockwork patterns on Stella's photographs. What do you make of them?
I can find some rationale in calling them a mechanical problem in the camera. Some of the consistencies from frame to frame indicate that the exposure was produced not in the camera, but somewhere as a light leak entering the camera, or some other pattern. The pattern appears to be very similar, but not always the same.
What does this mean?
This causes me to believe that either there's some type of mind projection, either she's somehow projecting these images onto the film from her imagination, from her own mind, or that another theory, which is certainly not provable, not by me anyway, is could things exist in another dimension, in a borderline way where they flicker in and out of our dimension.
And Sightings was a TV program geared towards the paranormal. It would be in their interest to exaggerate the mystery. You can choose to accept the normal explanation, which requires a lot of finger pointing, or the paranormal explanation, which requires faith in the supernatural or the extraterrestrial. But before you make your decision, and this is not clickbait, I want you to watch this video. This was from a decorated Navy officer with video proof of a UFO or UAP ship, and you let me know if this was also a hallucination or pareidolia.